Good afternoon and welcome to a good friend of mine, Tara Steele. Some of you may have seen her chatting and posting of all sorts of knowledge and expertise in this landscape. So it's great to have you here, Tara. And you're going to be talking to us about digital ghosts. So I shall hand it over to you. The floor is yours. Look forward to it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Andy. Hello, everyone. So, my name's Tara Steele. I'm the director of the Safe AI for Children Alliance, and I'm here today to talk to you about something that Andy just mentioned. You might not have heard of it before. My talk today is about Griefbots. So, Griefbots, AI-powered chatbots, and they're designed to simulate people who've passed away. They're marketed, the type I'm talking about today, are marketed as a way to continue a conversation with loved ones and to provide emotional support. And some services that make these grief bots even suggest that users need never say goodbye and offer an ongoing AI-generated interaction long after a person's passed away. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the nature of those grief bots and how they work, and explore some real world and hypothetical scenarios. And then most importantly, discuss the serious ethical and psychological risks that they pose, particularly for children. Because these technologies are not just a futuristic idea, they're already here, and they're already kind of shaping how people, including children, interact with loss and with these types of memories. And if you've ever experienced a close loss, then you know just how painful that can feel. It can feel totally overwhelming. And if you can kind of imagine in that moment of despair and vulnerability, if you can imagine being offered a way out of that, a way to bring the person back, not literally, obviously, but virtually. And even actually without experiencing loss, we've all seen kind of films where someone's in intense grief and they'll repeatedly play voicemails just to hear the person's voice again, cling on to letters they've written, or go over their text messages again and again. And it's just a very natural impulse to want to cling on in that kind of way. And what grief bots of this nature do is they take that to a whole new kind of level. So the companies who market these current grief bots say that they offer a way to bring a person back through text messages, voice recordings, or even VR simulations going forward. But what makes this quite a different concept to the kind of things I just mentioned, clinging on to real memories, is that the AI behind these models is generative. So it's trained on real historic data, like descriptions of the person and what they were like, transcripts of their messages, their social media posts, voice recordings. But then from that real data, it generates new conversations and interactions, so ones that never really happened in real life. So really, grief bots aim to generate a simulation of your loved ones still being here. And that is really what makes this concept quite fundamentally different to any way of grieving that we've seen before, like literally in the history of the world. So in lots of different cultures and around different periods of time, we can look back and we can see there are lots of different ways of remembering the dead and of processing the loss, and lots of different rituals around losing people. But we've never seen anything that has literally offered a way to supposedly bring them back in this kind of way. And that just brings up all sorts of questions. But the one I'll keep going back to today is, what does this mean for children growing up in a world where it seems that the dead can speak? So let's start to talk about some of the psychological and ethical risks of grief bots, and there are a lot. So we know that we've already seen really truly tragic cases where people have formed quite profound emotional attachments to so-called AI companion bots, with sometimes very devastating consequences. And when someone, especially a child, interacts with a chatbot or a grief bot, they're engaging with something that mimics understanding, but it doesn't actually understand, but it can seem very, very real. And the emotional risks of that are huge. And that's one of the reasons that I would strongly suggest that right now, in their current form, grief bots are completely inappropriate for children. And we don't really even need to go into some kind of balanced argument about it like we would for many other topics. I would suggest that it should be common sense that until child psychologists and developmental experts have conducted quite extensive research, these tools shouldn't be used by children. And perhaps that could change in the future based on such research. But right now, that's not just about being overly cautious. I would say it's just about doing the right thing and protecting children. And we'll go some more into the reasons for that. But just to say, just last week, actually, researchers at Cambridge University published findings that reinforce those concerns. So their research emphasised the need for appropriate safeguards when deploying these types of technologies. And then previously, the same authors have suggested that there should be restrictions to adult users only with these kind of chatbots. And also importantly, the requirement for meaningful consent from both the people whose data is used and those who interact with them. And we'll go some more into that as well. Because really, there are just so many issues to think about when we begin to explore the issues around grief bots and how we should be safeguarding children in this context. So let's think about some examples to demonstrate that. And I would just say that almost all of these examples are intended to raise questions rather than kind of try and tell you answers. And there's a lot that we just need to think about. So first of all, let's think, for example, of a grieving child who's lost a parent. But instead of learning to process that loss, they're given a grief bot. So a chatbot programmed to talk like their deceased mother or father. And that perhaps is comforting at first. The child might confide in it, seek reassurance, and perhaps come to depend on it emotionally. But now imagine that grief bot suddenly disappears. So perhaps the subscription ends, or a surviving parent intervenes and removes it, or can't pay for the subscription anymore. What happens to that child's grief then? So they haven't fully processed their loss. They just postponed it and changed it. And when the bot's gone, that grief could hit them even harder, leaving them feeling abandoned all over again. And then there's quite a worrying issue of commercialization. So imagine, for example, a grieving adult using a free grief bot service. So they haven't paid for the premium upgrade version. And they're mid-conversation, opening up about their emotions. And suddenly the bot version of their loved one says, "You sound stressed. Would you like to try this herbal remedy? Here's a voucher for 10% off." And that's really, potentially, things could become quite disturbing with that, because then it's like grief has become a marketing opportunity, which might be problematic. And if adults can be manipulated in that kind of way or influenced in that kind of way, what about children who don't yet have the critical thinking skills to even recognize when they might be being influenced? And then here's another fundamental problem. Grief bots aren't just limited to what they know about the deceased, in other words, what they've been trained on. They can also literally make things up. So those are often called AI hallucinations, where large language models generate false, but often highly convincing information. So basically, an AI system like this can start inferring or inventing stories that never happened. And so a grieving child could be led to believe that their parents said something or did something that they never actually did. And you can begin to imagine the potential emotional fallout from that if it was something quite inconsistent with real life. And then even when the grief bots don't make actual mistakes, they can still prevent a very incomplete or distorted version of a person. So you could imagine, for example, someone who in real life was a very warm and loving person, but maybe they sent several complaint emails to a customer service provider. If those emails made up a large part of the GriefBot's training data, will the GriefBot then portray them as the kind and loving person they were, or as angry and negative, as you could infer just from those emails? Or similarly, what if someone had posted like a single frustrated comment about their partner online on social media, and then they later passed away? Will the bot then reflect that as some kind of fundamental trait? So potentially making their grieving spouse, who's using a grief bot, believe something that was never really true. So what happens there is the grief bot generated an incorrect inference that the person didn't really like their partner based on that single frustrated social media post that the person maybe quickly typed out in anger after an argument. And children in particular would then be at risk of taking those kind of AI generated versions of their loved ones just at face value. They might believe on an emotional level that they're, or even a literal level for younger children, that they're interacting with an accurate version of their lost parent or lost sibling when they aren't. And that can potentially have long-term consequences for their emotional development, lead to confusion, distress, or resentment if the bot presents a version of their loved one that they just don't recognize. So the more you think about grief bots, the more complex ethical dilemmas emerge, situations that really show just how little we've thought through the implications of this kind of technology. So let's consider another potential hypothetical dilemma. What if you have a woman who has suffered in an abusive relationship, who dies in a car accident, for example? Her abusive former partner wants to create a grief bot using their private messages and communications, and he intends to continue those patterns of very abusive behaviour with the grief bot. Should her mother, for example, have any say in whether he can create that digital simulation and continue those patterns of abuse, even if it's only with an AI? What about the lady herself? She didn't consent to that. And what if it were a child? Would that change anything? Who owns the right to someone's digital afterlife, if anyone? Or you could imagine another scenario. We could have a parent of a young child who creates their own grief bot before dying of a terminal illness. And they train it with specific political beliefs, maybe quite extreme, that they hold at that time. And then years later, as the child grows up, that static AI version of their parent continues to promote those views, but those views might have evolved had the parent lived. And what if the surviving parent disagrees with those historic views? Then who has the right to modify that or shut down the bot? And what does that mean for the children? Should we even allow a situation where grief bots are engaging in kind of ideological discussions, particularly with children? And then what, similarly, cultural and religious differences. So some faiths obviously have strict beliefs about how the dead should be remembered and honoured. And if a person from a conservative religious background dies, and that maybe they have more secular family members who want to create a grief bot, something that their religion would have considered disrespectful, then whose beliefs take precedence? You have the issue of consent again. Is it the deceased, the families? Who gets to decide? Does it matter? I'd suggest it does matter, but these are questions we have to consider. And they're not really just theoretical questions, because they are the kind of real world situations that will arise as this technology becomes more widespread. And if we haven't figured out how to handle these kind of complex scenarios for adults, then how can we possibly justify exposing children to these grief bots? So before we even consider allowing grief bots for children, I'd suggest that we need major research in several areas. So first of all, we need long-term developmental impact studies. So we don't yet know how grief bots affect a child's emotional and psychological development. That needs to change before they're made available, if they ultimately are to be made available. Second, we need grief processing analysis. So we need to know with a good degree of certainty whether grief bots help or hinder the natural grieving process, and that answer just isn't clear yet. We also need strong safety protocols. So AI grief bots need to have robust safeguards to prevent manipulation, commercial exploitation, and psychological harm. And we also need professional integration frameworks. So if grief bots have any legitimate use, then they should be integrated with professional grief counselling frameworks, not just handed to users with no guidance. And on a similar note, we need strict ethics guidelines. So we need teams of psychologists, grief counsellors, ethicists, child development experts to create the ethical boundaries for these tools before they're widely available and accessible. So what happens next? What do we do if we're to be responsible and protect children? So we need regulations. So for example, we need mandatory disclaimers. So every interaction should come with a warning that this is an AI, not a real person. And that's something that's potentially already covered with AI of this nature by the EU AI Act, although there are issues there, but it's not elsewhere. And that measure certainly isn't enough by itself, because we don't have good evidence that it really works. And there are also questions around that, because that's literally the purpose of these grief bots, in a way, is to make people believe that they are real. But I would suggest we need those disclaimers. And then also, as I've already made clear, we need rules and regulations preventing children from accessing grief bots at this time. And if that's to change in future, it would need to be based on very good reasons. I would suggest we also need bans on monetization, so no targeted advertising based on grief. And we should also explore the idea of time limits on grief bot access. So it seems sensible to consider whether these tools should really be used indefinitely. Like, is that a healthy and helpful thing to do? And then we need ongoing oversight, so ethics boards to audit grief bot algorithms to ensure they're not exploiting grief to manipulate users in any way. So if grief bots are to continue to evolve, they must be highly regulated and ethically developed if we're to be responsible and if we're to protect children. Because otherwise, we're not just playing with technology, we're playing with people's their very deepest emotions. And I would certainly argue that we shouldn't be doing that, particularly not with children. But where do we go from here? So I would make the point that AI grief bots and similar technologies around the same concept aren't necessarily inherently bad. So while there are obviously very, very significant risks, it is possible that under the right conditions and with appropriate safeguards, maybe they could provide a kind of constructive comfort in certain circumstances. But that's not something that we can just assume. Is something that must be thoroughly investigated by responsible professionals, including, like I said, psychologists, grief counsellors, ethicists, child safety professionals, to determine whether they can be deployed safely and beneficially, even actually for adults. And the path forward really needs to be guided by evidence, not by technological capabilities alone. So then, while adults might then choose to engage with these technologies, understanding their limitations and accepting the risks, children need our protection. And we, as adults, can't experiment with their emotional development in real time in these kind of ways. And that really leads me on to my closing thoughts, which are, I would suggest that 1, the dead shouldn't sell us products. 2, they shouldn't be misrepresented by flawed AI. And then 3, these technologies most certainly shouldn't become some kind of psychological experiments on developing minds. So we really must resist the temptation to deploy quick technological fixes to really complex emotional challenges, especially where children are concerned. And instead, we should focus on developing and supporting proven methods of helping children to process grief in healthy ways. So through human connection, professional support, and just age-appropriate coping strategies. Because grief, while it's incredibly difficult and painful, it is a crucial and inevitable part of our human experience. And I think that as we collectively kind of navigate this new era of generative AI, we really must ensure that in our quest to ease suffering, we don't just create greater harm. And that's really quite a fundamental issue here. So until really rigorous research proves otherwise, I think that we must protect children from potentially harmful technological proposed solutions to grief. So in closing, we can say that the ghosts of the AI age are here. And I think the question to us all is, what will we do with them? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tara. Super insightful talk and presentation as always there, and some great comments. You might not have read them, but some great comments in the chat there. The one thing that I noticed, you used a phraseology there, the digital afterlife. And I was there thinking, do we need to phrase something like that? Do we need a law that looks at the digital afterlife? In fact, I haven't seen that anywhere before. Um, Anyone proposed it or discussed it. In fact, we could even touch on the fact that, we know that been some victims of sextortion, and parents have been trying to get information about those accounts. That in theory could fall under the, that level of it as well, the digital afterlife. So do you think we should have a law around that, or a regulation under digital afterlife?
So I definitely think that we need regulations. The whole kind of digital afterlife whether to call it an industry, digital afterlife industry. It covers quite a wide scope, as well as the kind of grief bots that I've been talking about. So there are also some really positive use cases in terms of remembering kind of historical events. So I can talk more about that, but my point is that it's a really broad area and it's really new, and regulations and certainly laws are struggling to keep up. And there is some really promising initial research. There's just a very small amount of it. So it's going to be really challenging to have meaningful regulations that keep up with the technology, because it's developing so fast, and then secondly, laws, same would apply to an even greater extent.
Absolutely. I think I've even seen some technology out of mainly the Far East, where you can actually put the VR headsets on, and you are meeting your deceased family member and you interact with them, which is, I mean, the technology is amazing. I give you that, but you know, I haven't seen any control or anything around that, which is quite scary.
Yeah, there's a so that one that I think the one you're probably referring to. There's a documentary that's called Eternal You, and it's available on BBC iPlayer in the UK, and then I think you can get it on YouTube and Amazon. And it documents that case in Korea, and it's a mother who's interacting with a VR headset with her young daughter who's passed away. And it's incredibly difficult to watch. But I'd recommend that documentary if anyone's interested in learning more. That's called Eternal You. And it goes into this quite a lot, so shows some really interesting examples. But that part in particular is quite difficult to watch.
I mean, if you have a link to that, and if you put it, either if you share it with us or you put it on your LinkedIn, I'm sure we can get that out for anybody who wants to see that. That'd be super interesting, and obviously it would raise awareness of the issue as well. Uh, I will open it up to any questions. We've got time. It's not a problem. Um, Obviously, I think this is a topic, as you say, that hasn't really been touched on or discussed. Um, and it affects everywhere, like all of this does. It affects every country and every gender and every culture in the world. So, and it's scary to think that it's only going to get bigger and bigger, and without any control, it's scary.
I think that's inevitable, because it's a way to make money, and it's quite possible that some of the developers have some good motivations behind that. I don't want to assume that everyone's doing it for commercial gain, but that certainly is happening. Again, that documentary I referenced, you can see the different approaches of developers within that, but it is going to grow because you can make money out of it.
We have a question, which is: does your discomfort or concern with this decrease if we require that chatbots need to be prescribed by a medical professional? That question's in the chat, so if you do want to read it.
Yeah, that's an interesting idea, that I have come across, to sort of treat them as medical devices. And if that it would depend on a couple of, there's a caveat with that. But first of all, if it were being treated in that way, then that would be a regulated way of doing it and quite controlled and have the person's best interests at heart. If it were literally being prescribed by medical professionals in that way, the kind of caveat that I mentioned is that could also be used as a way to get around regulations. So, for example, I think in the EU AI Act, it could be treated differently if it were marketed as something to help with mental health problems. So it's sort of double-edged sword in that respect.
Yeah, it's funny. One word popped into my head then, which I sort of hate this word, but we have to use it, and that's collaboration, isn't it? So, if the medical profession were to do it, collaborate with the tech professionals, the people who understand it. It makes me think a little bit of safety by design. You can be a tech developer or a tech designer and have that capabilities, but you also need the knowledge area and the topic knowledge to know what you're doing. So again, it's
Yeah.
back to this word of collaboration, isn't it?
And actually, I think that's a really fundamental point. Like, to do it thoughtfully, um, really is the first step. Even before we can get regulations in, just try and do the right thing, rather than just try and make money.
If only it was that easy. I think we've just solved all the world's problems just by saying that there.
It would be good to see that.
Yeah, yeah. No, absolutely fabulous talk, as I say. Sorry, I'm just reading the comments.
Yeah.
Um, you know, and yeah, as we say, this is an area, as you say, it's a money-making area. People are spotting the gaps with it. Um, from a business perspective, we can't argue with that. People are finding gaps, and it's all about money in the world, isn't it? But yeah, it has to be controlled. It has to be done in the right way, and we have to find, as you said, the research as well. We need the research into this.
Yeah, and like I said, there is some research. It's really interesting. I'll do a LinkedIn post and I'll link the research papers that I've drawn most on, in that post, in case anyone's interested in reading them, and then the documentary I mentioned, and then also just like for kind of expanding thought about this. There's a really good Black Mirror episode. It's called "Be Right Back." Just if you want to think more about these things and the dilemmas they raise.
Fantastic. I mean, I think again, like all of these talks, we could talk for ages and ages about this. And obviously, I'm sure you're okay. If people want to reach out to you by whatever means, then please do so. Or if you're hanging around, be in the lobby. If not, anybody who would like to connect with Tara, get in touch with us. Or I know she's on LinkedIn. By all means, look her up. She's more than willing to speak to you. Again, thanks again, Tara. Super insightful. Brilliant talk. You can tell by the comment. And thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Andy, and thank you everyone for your time.